What if the biggest mistake you're making is saying too much? What if every message you send, every explanation you give is actually stopping her from realizing what she lost? Because the truth is, when guilt doesn't get interrupted, it grows. And when it grows, it changes everything. So instead of chasing, convincing, or explaining, what happens when you simply go silent? Silence reveals truth in a way that words never can because most people don't actually listen to what is being said. They respond to it, defend against it, or manipulate it to suit their own comfort. When you speak, especially in emotional situations, you give the other person something to work with. They can twist your words, misunderstand your intentions, or use your reactions to justify their behavior. But when you choose silence, you remove all of that. You take away the noise, the distractions, and the constant back and forth that often hides what is really going on beneath the surface. Silence strips the situation down to its core, leaving nothing but actions, patterns, and reality. And reality is very difficult to ignore when there are no words left to cover it up. When you stop explaining yourself, something interesting happens. The other person no longer has your voice to rely on, so they are left with their own thoughts. And most people are not as comfortable with their own thoughts as they think they are. In the absence of your reassurance, your attention, or your presence, they begin to replay moments in their mind. They start to question what happened, what they said, and what they may have lost. This is where truth begins to surface, not because you forced it out, but because silence created the space for it to emerge naturally. You didn't have to argue, convince, or prove anything. You simply stepped back, and in doing so, allowed them to see things without your influence. Silence also reveals truth about the other person's intentions. When you stop initiating contact or trying to maintain the connection, their behavior becomes clearer. If they genuinely value you, they will feel your absence and make an effort to bridge the gap. If they don't, they will remain distant, passive, or indifferent. This clarity is powerful because it removes the confusion that often comes from mixed signals and emotional conversations. Instead of trying to interpret words, you are observing actions, and actions are always more honest. Silence becomes a filter that separates genuine interest from convenience, effort from excuses, and respect from neglect. At the same time, silence reveals truth about you. It forces you to sit with your own emotions without immediately reacting or seeking validation. You begin to understand your own patterns, how quickly you try to fix things, how much you tolerate, and how often you prioritize keeping someone over respecting yourself. Without the distraction of constant communication, you become more aware of what you truly feel, what you actually need, and what you have been ignoring. This kind of awareness is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary because the truth is not just about what the other person did. It is also about what you allowed, what you overlooked, and what you continued despite knowing better. There is also a certain kind of honesty that only exists in absence. When you are always present, always available, always explaining, people don't feel the weight of losing you. Your presence becomes familiar, expected, and eventually taken for granted. But silence interrupts that pattern. It removes the certainty they had about you always being there and replaces it with uncertainty. That uncertainty forces them to confront their own feelings. Do they miss you, or do they just miss the attention? Do they value you, or did they simply get used to you? These are questions that only silence can answer because words often blur the line between genuine emotion and temporary comfort. Silence is not passive, it is revealing. It exposes what conversations often hide and what emotions often distort. It allows time, distance, and absence to do what explanations cannot. without interference, without pressure, and without constant interaction. The truth surfaces on its own terms, showing you exactly where you stand without needing to ask for it. Guilt grows in absence because when you remove your presence, you also remove the comfort that was protecting the other person from fully feeling the impact of their actions. As long as you are there, texting, calling, explaining, or trying to fix things, you are unknowingly softening the consequences for them. Your presence becomes a cushion that absorbs the weight of what they did, allowing them to move on without truly confronting it. But the moment you step back, that cushion disappears. There is no distraction, no reassurance, no emotional escape. What remains is a quiet space where their thoughts become louder, and in that space, guilt begins to take shape. When someone no longer has access to you, their mind naturally starts to revisit the past. Moments that once seemed small or insignificant begin to feel heavier. Things they dismissed earlier now return with more clarity. This is because absence removes the immediacy of emotion and replaces it with reflection. In real time, people often react defensively, protecting their ego and justifying their behavior. But in silence, without the pressure to respond or defend themselves, those justifications start to weaken. The mind replays conversations, re examines actions, and slowly begins to acknowledge what was ignored before. This is where guilt deepens, not through confrontation, but through realization. Absence also creates a sense of loss that intensifies emotional awareness. When you are no longer there to provide attention, validation, or consistency, the contrast becomes undeniable. People often don't recognize the value of what they have while it is easily available. It is only when that availability is removed that they begin to feel its absence. That feeling of something missing can trigger a deeper level of introspection. They start to connect their current emptiness with their past behavior, and that connection fuels guilt. It is no longer just about what happened, it becomes about what they had and how they contributed to losing it. Another reason guilt grows in absence is because there is no longer an opportunity to immediately fix things or seek forgiveness. When you are still present, people can apologize quickly, say what they think you want to hear, or attempt to smooth things over without truly changing. But when you are gone, that option is no longer available. They are left with unresolved emotions and unanswered questions. That lack of closure can be unsettling, and it forces them to sit with the discomfort they may have previously avoided. Without the ability to instantly repair the situation, the weight of their actions lingers longer, giving guilt more time to develop and settle in. Absence also removes external validation that might have supported their behavior. When you are actively engaging, even in conflict, you are still participating in the dynamic. This participation can sometimes make the other person feel justified, as if the situation is mutual rather than one-sided. But when you withdraw completely, that illusion fades. There is no longer any interaction to blur the lines or shift responsibility. They are left alone with their actions, without any external input to dilute or redirect the blame. This isolation can make the truth harder to ignore, and as that truth becomes clearer, guilt naturally follows. Over time, silence and distance create a psychological environment where emotions evolve. Initial defensiveness can turn into curiosity, curiosity into reflection, and reflection into regret. This process cannot be rushed or forced, which is why absence is so powerful. It allows emotions to develop organically without interference or pressure. Guilt, when it emerges in this way, tends to be more genuine because it is not a reaction to confrontation. It is a response to self-awareness. And self-awareness is something no one can escape when they are left alone with their thoughts long enough. Over-explaining kills your power because it shifts your position from someone who knows their worth to someone who feels the need to justify it. The moment you start explaining yourself excessively, you are no longer standing in confidence. You are seeking understanding, approval, or validation from someone who may not even be willing to give it. Instead of your actions speaking for themselves, your words begin to carry the burden, and words are always easier to question, challenge, or ignore. The more you explain, the more you invite the other person to dissect your intentions, reinterpret your meaning, and find gaps in your logic. What should have been clear and self evident becomes a debate, and in that process, your authority over your own experience begins to weaken. When emotions are involved, over explaining often comes from a desire to be seen and understood. You want the other person to fully grasp how you feel, why you feel it, and what led you to that point. But the reality is, people don't misunderstand you as much as you think. They often understand, they just don't agree, or they don't care enough to respond in the way you expect. So when you keep explaining, repeating, and clarifying, you are not increasing clarity. You are increasing your own vulnerability in a situation where the other person has already shown limited willingness to meet you where you are. This creates an imbalance where you are investing more energy into being understood than they are into understanding you. Over explaining also reduces the emotional impact of your words. When something is said simply and directly, it carries weight. It feels intentional, controlled, and confident. But when it is followed by long justifications, repeated clarifications, and detailed breakdowns, that weight starts to dilute. The message becomes less about what you are saying and more about how desperately you want it to be accepted. This can unintentionally signal insecurity, even if your feelings are valid. The other person may start to focus less on the content of your words and more on your need to explain them, which shifts the dynamic in their favor. They gain the upper hand because they are no longer responding to a firm boundary, they are responding to a negotiation. Another aspect of over-explaining is that it gives the other person too much control over the narrative. The more you say, the more material they have to work with. They can pick apart certain points, ignore others, or twist your words to fit their perspective. Instead of standing on a clear, unshakable position, you become entangled in a conversation that keeps expanding without resolution. This is especially true when dealing with someone who avoids accountability. Your explanations become opportunities for them to deflect, redirect, or minimize the situation. In trying to make them understand, you end up giving them more ways to avoid responsibility. Over explaining can also come from discomfort with silence. Silence feels uncertain, and many people rush to fill it because they fear being misunderstood or judged. But that silence is often where your power lies. When you say what needs to be said and then stop, you leave space for the other person to process, respond, or reveal their true stance. When you keep talking, you take away that space and replace it with noise. That noise can blur the clarity of your message and reduce its effectiveness. Silence, on the other hand, creates tension, and tension often leads to truth. There is also a deeper layer to over-explaining, which is the fear of losing the connection. When you feel like something is slipping, your instinct may be to hold on tighter by communicating more, explaining more, and trying harder. But this often has the opposite effect. Instead of strengthening the connection, it can push the other person further away, especially if they are already pulling back. Your effort becomes overwhelming rather than reassuring, and your words lose their impact because they are no longer measured, they are continuous. Power comes from clarity, restraint, and self-assurance. It comes from knowing that your feelings and boundaries do not require endless justification to be valid. When you express yourself with intention and then allow your words to stand on their own, you maintain control over your narrative. You show that you trust your own perspective without needing constant validation. And in that restraint, there is a quiet strength that cannot be easily challenged or diminished. Self-respect over validation is a shift that most people understand intellectually but struggle to apply emotionally, especially in relationships where attention, approval, and reassurance can feel like proof of worth. Validation is addictive because it gives you an immediate sense of being seen, chosen, and valued. It feels good in the moment, and for a while, it can even feel like confidence. But the problem with validation is that it depends on someone else. It is external, unpredictable, and often inconsistent. When you rely on it, your sense of worth rises and falls based on how someone treats you, responds to you, or prioritizes you. Self respect, on the other hand, is internal. It is not based on how someone feels about you, but on how you choose to treat yourself regardless of their behavior. When you prioritize validation, you begin to adjust yourself to maintain it. You tolerate things you normally wouldn't. You stay silent when something bothers you, and you make excuses for behavior that doesn't align with your values. This isn't because you don't see the problem, but because you fear losing the attention or approval that person gives you. Over time, this creates a quiet compromise within yourself. You start abandoning your own standards in exchange for temporary emotional comfort. The more you do this, the more disconnected you become from your own sense of identity because your actions are no longer guided by what you believe is right. They are guided by what keeps you accepted. Self-respect requires a different kind of strength. It asks you to choose discomfort over temporary satisfaction. It means walking away from situations where you feel undervalued, even if part of you still wants the connection. It means setting boundaries that may not be received well and standing by them anyway. This is difficult because it doesn't give you immediate rewards. In fact, it can feel like loss in the beginning. You might lose attention, lose access, or lose the version of the relationship you were hoping for. But what you gain is far more stable. You gain clarity, control, and a deeper sense of self-worth that is not dependent on anyone else's behavior. There is also a subtle confidence that comes with self-respect that validation can never provide. When you respect yourself, you don't feel the need to constantly prove your value or seek reassurance. You are not easily shaken by someone's inconsistency or lack of effort because your worth is not tied to their actions. This doesn't mean you don't care or that you become detached. It means you care from a place of stability rather than need. You can appreciate attention when it is given, but you are not defined by its presence or absence. This creates a different dynamic in your interactions, where you are no longer trying to earn a place in someone's life. You are deciding whether they deserve a place in yours. Choosing self-respect also changes how others perceive and treat you. When you no longer chase validation, you naturally stop accepting behavior that falls below your standards. This sets a tone that people can feel, even if it is not explicitly stated. You become more selective, more grounded, and less reactive. And while this may push some people away, it also attracts those who are aligned with your level of self-awareness and respect. The relationships that remain are more balanced because they are not built on one person constantly seeking approval and the other providing it conditionally. At its core, self-respect is about alignment. It is about ensuring that your actions reflect your values, even when it is inconvenient or uncomfortable. It is about choosing long-term integrity over short-term validation. When you operate from this place, you no longer need to convince anyone of your worth because you are already living in a way that reflects it. And that internal alignment creates a sense of peace that external validation can never sustain. People value what they feel they lost because presence often becomes invisible when it is constant. When something or someone is always there, available, responsive, consistent, it slowly shifts from being appreciated to being expected. The human mind adapts quickly to what is familiar, and once something feels guaranteed, it loses its sense of rarity. This is not always intentional or malicious, it is simply how perception works. What is easily accessible rarely feels valuable in the same way as something that requires effort, uncertainty, or the possibility of loss. As a result, when you are always present in someone's life, your value can become understated, not because you lack worth, but because your presence has become part of their normal. The shift happens when that presence is removed. Absence creates contrast, and contrast creates awareness. When you are no longer there in the same way, no longer giving the same attention, energy, or consistency, the difference becomes noticeable. What once blended into the background now stands out in its absence. This is when people begin to recognize the role you played in their life, not through words, but through the gap you leave behind, the conversations that no longer happen, the support that is no longer available, the familiarity that is suddenly gone. All of these create a sense of loss that forces reflection. Loss has a unique way of sharpening perception. When something is taken away, the mind naturally starts to revisit it, often with more appreciation than it had in the moment. People begin to remember the good more vividly, to replay moments with a different perspective, and to question their own behavior in ways they didn't before. This doesn't necessarily mean they were unaware of your value. It means they didn't fully feel it. Feeling is different from knowing. You can know someone is important, but until their absence creates an emotional impact, that importance doesn't fully register. Loss turns abstract value into something tangible and undeniable. There is also an emotional weight attached to losing something that was once secure. When someone believes they have consistent access to you, they operate with a certain level of comfort. They assume that no matter what happens, you will still be there. This assumption can lead to complacency, where effort decreases and appreciation fades. But when that certainty is disrupted, it creates a sense of instability. The mind starts to question what went wrong, what could have been done differently, and whether the situation can be restored. This questioning is what drives a deeper recognition of value because it is no longer about maintaining something, it is about understanding what has already slipped away. At the same time, loss removes the ability to take immediate action. When something is still present, there is always an opportunity to fix things, to make changes, or to show appreciation. But once it is gone, that opportunity becomes uncertain or even unavailable. This limitation adds to the sense of urgency and regret because people realize that their previous inaction now has consequences. The absence becomes a reminder not only of what was lost, but also of what was not done when there was still time. This combination of reflection and regret often intensifies the perceived value of what is no longer there. It is important to understand that this process is not about creating loss as a strategy, but about recognizing how human perception works. Value is often tied to emotional experience, and emotional experience is influenced by change, contrast, and uncertainty. When everything remains the same, the mind stops actively processing it. But when something changes, especially when something is removed, it forces a reevaluation. That reevaluation is where value becomes clearer, not because it suddenly appeared, but because it is finally being seen without the filter of familiarity and assumption. Let actions teach, not words, because words can be shaped, softened, or strategically used to create an impression, while actions reveal intention without needing interpretation. When someone tells you who they are or what they feel, there is always room for doubt, misunderstanding, or even manipulation. But when you observe what they consistently do, their effort, their consistency, their priorities, you are seeing a form of truth that does not rely on explanation. Actions don't need to convince you, they show you. And yet, many people ignore this clarity because words are more comforting. Words can promise change, offer reassurance, and temporarily ease discomfort, even when they are not supported by behavior. When you rely too heavily on words, you become vulnerable to inconsistency. You start holding on to what was said instead of what is being done. This creates a gap between expectation and reality, where you are waiting for actions to eventually align with promises. In that waiting, you often excuse behavior that doesn't meet your standards because you are focused on potential rather than evidence. But when you shift your focus to actions, that gap disappears. You are no longer analyzing what someone meant. You are observing what they chose to do. And choice is always more revealing than intention, because intention without action has no real impact. Allowing actions to teach also requires patience and restraint. It means you don't rush to confront every inconsistency or demand immediate clarity through conversation. Instead, you step back and observe patterns over time. Patterns cannot be faked easily. Anyone can behave differently for a moment, especially when they feel pressure or want to create a certain impression. But consistency over time reveals what is natural, what is genuine, and what is sustainable. By giving space for those patterns to emerge, you gain a clearer understanding of the situation without needing constant explanations or reassurances. There is also a form of self-respect in letting actions guide your decisions. When you prioritize what someone does over what they say, you are setting a standard for how you allow yourself to be treated. You are no longer negotiating your worth based on promises or intentions. You are responding to reality. This creates a stronger sense of control because your decisions are grounded in observable behavior rather than emotional interpretation. You don't have to guess, assume, or overanalyze. The information is already there, shown through effort, consistency, and presence, or the lack of it.